you can catch it at a later date. So I'm going to just start sharing my screen, but just so that you all know, we're going to do sort of some presentation time and then take a break for some questions and then do another segment of presentation and take another break for questions after that. And so if you have a question throughout the presentation, please use the chat box to put your question in. And Kyle and Lisa will be monitoring that and will address the questions during the question and answer period. As mentioned, if you do have, we'd like everybody to keep their video off and your microphone muted, as that should make the webinar go a little bit smoother. And we're going to share the screen and see where we get here. Lisa, can I get a verbal that you can just see the big slides?
No, we cannot.
You cannot.
We cannot.
Well.
Is it because we have all this shit up?
Maybe Kirby, can you give me a verbal? Can you see?
No, Carrie, we don't have anything.
Interesting. Okay, hang on.
Are you on multiple monitors? Is that the issue?
It wasn't when I tested it. You know how that goes.
Of course.
Let's try it again.
Yeah, you're good. Now you just need to go into presentation view.
All right.
Good.
All right, thanks. Sometimes I wonder why you do tests. I guess it's so that you can have a false sense of security thinking you're going to go in no problem. And I also jinxed myself by saying we weren't going to have any issues. But welcome everyone, and thank you for taking the time out of your evening to spend with us to talk a little bit about beavers in our landscape. Before we get going, tonight in the spirit of respect, reciprocity, and truth, I want to honor and acknowledge that here in Alberta, we live, work, and play on the traditional territories of the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, whose footsteps have marked these lands for centuries. That long relationship includes both experience and knowledge gained, and a deep and strong sense of connection to the land, water, and wildlife, including beavers. I'm joining you tonight from Edmonton, in the Treaty 6 region, and many of you are joining from traditional territories around Alberta, including Treaty 7 and 8. For those of you joining from outside of Alberta, please take a moment to acknowledge the traditional territories that you are in. So I'm looking forward to sharing with you a little bit about the experience of living with beavers in our landscape and understanding them a little bit better from a behavioral aspect, ecological, practical side of things, and just thinking about expanding our knowledge about why beavers do what they do and how we can, how that affects us, and then how we can potentially be a little more proactive in terms of how we deal and manage with beavers in our land. So this is a sort of condensed version of a somewhat longer workshop that has been developed over the past 5 or 6 years through a collaborative with the Mastaki Institute called Putting Beavers to Work for Watershed Resiliency and Restoration. And it's got a number of components. There's research, there's extension, there's education associated with this initiative, as well as developing demonstration sites and opportunities to test drive some of these different techniques that actually in Alberta are relatively new. I do want to acknowledge the funders of the collaborative, including the municipality and county partners, as well as individual landowners who have have been trialing these things in their own lands, as well as being willing to share and allowing others to learn from them. The funding for this particular initiative is coming from the Watershed Restoration and Resiliency Program, as well as Alberta Eco Trust on the Cows and Fish side. For those of you that aren't familiar, Cows and Fish is a not-for-profit organization, and these are just some of the members and supporters that help me do what I do. I'm a riparian specialist with Cows and Fish, and I'll get a little bit into sort of what we do in a minute here. But first of all, I'd like to know a little bit about you. So we've got some polls built into the webinar today. So the first one is just, I'd like to know sort of where you put yourself, sort of what hat you're wearing as you are here tonight. So which best describes you and the hat that you're wearing this evening?
Hello, I'm Wendy Both.
No, you're supposed to answer the questions.
Oh, answer the question.
Did you unmute?
I was just going to do my own.
Thanks, Wendy. Yeah, if you can just fill it through, go answer through the poll, that'd be awesome. So Kyle, when you've got a good percentage of folks, you can end the poll.
Yeah, just about there.
All right, so a variety of folks. Excellent, great. Well, I hope there's going to be something in here for everybody. And if the poll's not going away on your screen, you can just click either the X or the close button. And the second one is just a little bit of evaluation. So as part of the work that Cows and Fish does, we always monitoring and evaluating is a big part of what we do. So this one is just a bit of a pre-survey, sort of give me a sense of where you're at in terms of beavers, understanding beavers, management, different management options, that sort of thing. Just always good to know where we're starting from.
And submit. Turn your sound off.
Give it another couple of seconds. All right, good. Again, across the board, perfect. Wonderful. So a little bit about Cows and Fish. So we're also known as the Alberta Riparian Habitat Management Society. And the key words there are riparian habitat. So we work with producers and communities of all different sectors to better understand the riparian part of the landscape. And I myself have been with Cows and Fish for just about a little over 20 years, and in the role of providing extension, providing presentations, workshops, providing information, as well as technical advice on a variety of different things related to managing the riparian landscape. So riparian areas are those green zones of water-loving vegetation where the soils are influenced by the presence of water. So that water is either present at the surface that we can see, or it's also just underground and just influencing the vegetation through the roots. And over the years, and I imagine every one of you can attest to this, that where you've got water, you've got beavers. And as part of sort of the Cows and Fish role of creating awareness and understanding about riparian areas, the beaver question always came up. And so right around 6 years ago, some colleagues of mine, including Lauren Fitch, who's a fisheries biologist, helped to develop basically some awareness materials around beavers and how they fit into the landscape. So now we have this piece of riparian learning that we can provide to complement things like grazing management and, you know, creating buffer zones around crops, or, you know, urban riparian management. So the beaver piece has become a pretty important part of helping people understand these landscapes. So I think, you know, here in Canada and just North America around, you know, overall, we have a fair affinity to beaver. They're on our money up here. We've got, you know, a number of place names and, you know, creek names and towns and cities that all kind of reflect that sort of connection to the beaver. Canada and North America have basically been shaped by the beaver. They have, you know, it was the draw of the beaver felt for hats over in Europe that brought, you know, a lot of settlement here to our continent. So it was that lure of beaver pelts for the fashion industry in Europe that once the sort of beaver population on that side of the world had been extirpated for that purpose, they were looking for a new source. And across the oceans, we came to then look into our populations. So we've had a long history, you know, that 1800s to 1900s of beaver sort of extirpation here in North America. And throughout that time, you know, early 1900s, we have started to see them start to rebound, but not quite to what the historical levels might have been. So in the States, there's been some pretty interesting ways of trying to get beavers reintroduced to some of the backcountry landscapes that had been drying out over the years, particularly in the early 1900s. This is an effort to reintroduce beaver in Idaho using parachutes. And the parachute technique, I guess, resulted in about 1 beaver perishing in the effort, but they've well established since then and have been reconnecting landscapes in that part of the country ever since. So as here in Alberta, you know, as we started to realize the agricultural potential for this landscape, you know, mid 1900s, 1950, 60, 40 in there, the influence of beaver on that sort of sector started to become, you know, pretty prevalent. So since then, beavers have been considered a nuisance, they're a menace, they're a pest by a lot of different people. And part of that is just based on history. You know, when a lot of our ancestors arrived in the early 1900s, there were not a lot of beaver here. And the landscape had shifted from generally more wet with a lot of beaver activity to something somewhat drier. But in the last little while, there's been a number of efforts where people are starting to think about beavers just a little bit differently. The Beaver Whisperer is a video that came out several years ago now that started to shed, you know, a bit of a different light on beaver and sort of what their value might be, how they might be able to help us with some of the issues that we're facing. And even through the work of Dr. Glynis Hood, who's right here at the University of Alberta, starting to, again, learn a little more about the value of beaver and how they can start to help us potentially address some of the challenges that we're facing now related to water quality or water quantity or wildlife habitat, things like that. So throughout this presentation, I hope to present you know, a somewhat balanced approach. You know, are beavers good? Are they bad? Or are they just being beaver? And I think everybody has kind of their own opinion on that. And partly it's based on your experience. You know, if you've never had a problem with the beaver, you probably think there's no issue. They're great little critters. If you've had an issue, you might have a different opinion with and may want to, share some words that we can't really say online. So I hope to present some, this presentation is built off of research. It's built off of practical experiences of different people around the world, around North America. And I'm excited to, at some point, discuss a little bit about with you guys what your experiences are through the chat. But let's start with a little bit about basic beaver biology, because if we understand this little critter, we might be able to better figure how, why they're doing what they're doing, and then how we might be able to fit into that. So everybody's familiar with the buck tooth that those beavers have. It's that orange iron infused hard surface on the outside and a softer tissue on the underside. And they use that hard iron to keep their teeth sharp, because they grow all throughout their life. They're continuously growing. So the iron helps keep them sharp, and it also helps them to chew through their favorite food, which of course is wood. So typically in a beaver colony, you'll have about 6 individuals. So usually there's the 2 adults, 2 young of the year, and then the 2-year-olds that hang out for the first couple of years of their life. And the lodge is that mound of sticks that you sometimes see out in the middle of the open pond. And that's their home. That's their place to get out of the cold, get out of the weather, get away from predators, stay warm, and how they access their food cache through the winter. So you can also have lodges or dens right into a bank. But again, this is the house, this is the home. So if the adage is that the lodge is the castle, the pond is the moat. So within that family, after about 2 years, the young beavers start to disperse. They usually coinciding with high water in the spring. They go off to try and find a new spot to make their own home and find a mate. They do mate for life, the pair, until one dies. And it's the female that actually does quite a lot of the work. So beavers actually are quite territorial. So you may be out for a walk around a creek or a wetland, and you might see these mounds of soil. That's the beaver basically marking their territory. These scent mounds are a way for them to release their caster onto those mounds and basically say this area is occupied. No other beavers welcome. I think, the research says on average, there's typically about a colony every, like they like about 1 kilometer's worth of stream in an area, but I think it varies quite a bit. So they're herbivores. So they're eating the woody vegetation, everything from, leaves and cellulose under the bark. And they've got certain microbes in their gut that allow them to do that. And in the winter, they do, they cache their food. It's called a food cache. And so if you're driving by a pond and you might see a bunch of, sticks and branches sticking out of the water, that's the beaver creating their winter food store. Now it's the trickle of running water that actually sparks the beaver to do their main work. And that main work is the act of dam building. And the ponds that they're trying to build they need to be quite deep, because they need to be able to access their lodge openings and their food caches throughout the winter. So when they're building these ponds, ideally they've got, about 3/4 of a meter. So it's almost 3 feet of water depth, so that they can access and swim underwater. And the fluctuation of that pond, not going up or down, much more than 1.5 meters or so. So about, what's that, 6 or 9 feet, then that sort of makes them quite comfortable. So the dams are, there's a variety of, shapes and sizes that they come in. There's often made of sticks and mud and rock and anything that they can roll or drag into place. They're intentionally leaky, because that sort of allows the pressure not to build up behind them too much, and that allows the beaver to help to maintain them longer. So the largest beaver dam in the world is quite a feat. It's over 850 meters long up in Wood Buffalo National Park, and is visible from Google Earth even. So that's an area where there's vast open spaces, and you know, those beaver have a lot of habitat, and they've been there a long time doing a lot of work and maintaining a lot of water in that ecosystem up there. So the dams are, you know, they're often, sometimes they actually look quite neat and tidy, but other times they're, you know, just a mess of sticks and mud. And ultimately they are stopping that water to create that pond that will help them to survive over the winter and escape predator. So I mentioned that they can build out of a lot of different things. So cattails, often you'll find in there. You might find if you have, you know, set a pile of lumber, you know, nearby, you might find that you've lost your lumber, and check your beaver dam. It might be in there. I've seen or heard somebody say that they had a canoe tied up on their late little pond, and that ended up in the dam as well. So the sort of also the upstream side of the dam is where they work at on their depth, and they basically pull the mud from the bottom up on top to pack that dam in and create some of that depth. So as I mentioned, you know, these dams are somewhat leaky. They're designed to have, you know, a slow trickle of water going through them or under them, around them, kind of at all times when there is, you know, water in the system. And there's often not just one dam. You know, generally there's a complex or a sequence of them, and that again is related to them accessing food, keeping safe from predators, and just working their way around the watershed because they're more comfortable in water than they are on land. So there are some, you know, sort of ideal situations for beavers to live in, but they're also very adaptable, and they can try to build in a variety of places where one wouldn't think that they might. But typically, you know, they need to have an adequate aspen and willow forest that they can use because that's their main food supply. Not too fast of a gradient. So again, they can keep up with the water flow. And there also does need to be some water there so that they can basically stop it. So here's a question for you guys, this poll. What do you think is in a beaver's refrigerator? So the poll is going to come up, and the question is, what proportion of a beaver's annual diet is wood? We got 16%, 32%, 53%, 86, or 100.
Why do you want it to be unmuted?
Because I wanted to click.
All right, it's running the gamut. Good. All right. So most people thought 86, some people 53, some 50. Okay, good. Well, what we know is that about 53% of their annual diet is wood. Now in the winter, absolutely, we're right up around that 86% because that's what they've cached and that's what they've been able to keep on through the winter. But throughout the spring and summer, they'll eat lily pads, they'll eat cattails, grasses, sedges, you know, even the odd wildflower. And then as they start preparing, as those sort of herbaceous species start to die off, they start shifting into tree and shrub mode. They do kind of have a preferred size that they like. They kind of like that, what we call a sapling size. So, you know, about the yay big around. But they will, and they'll usually go, you know, they like to forage within about 30 meters of wherever their main pond is. But again, that varies. They will venture, you know, a lot farther to find that wood, and they'll also, you know, take their hand at some of the larger trees as well. They use about, you know, most of the wood that they fell, they utilize most of it. If they take down a larger tree, you know, the goal is not necessarily that they're going to utilize that entire tree, but they'll take the smaller branches that they can easily move into the dam, into the lodge, or into their food cache. The trees that get knocked down, you know, they create roughness on the landscape, they create decomposition, they add other pieces into the ecosystem than just being food and fodder for the beaver. The one interesting thing I think about some of these beaver ponds too is, as I said, they like to keep, you know, research will say that they like to stay within that 30 meters, but they will travel beyond that, particularly if their food source is limited. But of course, it's a risk versus reward kind of a thing. You know, when the longer they're out of water, you know, there's the higher risk that they're at. And so you'll often see these canals that they build, you know, these runs that help expand that reach of where they can get to. Now, I mentioned that willow and aspen are sort of some of their favorite foods, and it's there's been an evolution between these species and beaver. For example, the young sprouts on an aspen, once they've been chewed down, they actually have a bit of a bitter taste that the young shoots have, so that the beaver doesn't come back to chew on that tree again, and allows that tree to grow back up. Willow, similar thing. When it's cut off, it starts to, you know, super sprout, we'll say. Lots of sprouts, lots of new shoots coming up. And again, that helps perpetuate, you know, helps that plant to continue to grow. So it's kind of, you know, it's that taking to create more kind of an idea. And those cycles are, you know, boom and bust sometimes. Sometimes they eat themselves out of house and home, which causes them to move on to some different location, or their dams to fail because they're not there to maintain them anymore. But typically, if they've got sort of those main habitat features, the dams are going to stay intact, and they're going to continue to be active in that area. And just like, you know, the trees and the shrubs, they cycle through over their time. The ponds and wetlands that the beavers created, you know, they cycle as well. So sometimes they're an open, you know, wide open marsh kind of a situation. Other times, if water levels go down or they do move on, that pond will, you know, will start to grow in again. And it's just, again, that cycle of wet and dry and beaver there or beaver not. So, you know, the beaver play a really big part in building riparian functions, these riparian areas that I've been talking about. You know, they create higher water tables, they create rich soils because they act as a catch basin. They create a space for those trees and shrubs to grow that have deep roots that can stabilize stream banks and provide wildlife habitat. And if you've got a situation where, you know, a stream is basically separated itself from its floodplain and down cut, a beaver could potentially help with that, you know, help to widen the valley again, help to bring up that water table, and help to restore that, that connection to water, which is so very important for these riparian landscapes, important for growing food, important for having a water supply, important for having wildlife habitat. So often cases, you know, when we lose that vegetation, whether it's a combination of, you know, maybe beaver activity, but also some of the other activities on the landscape that removes that deep binding root mass, we can end up with like I said, a lower water table, just less water in the system overall, less resiliency. And where beavers have been restored, it just, you know, it just brings life back to some of these areas. So they do perform the function of filtering water, as I mentioned, trapping sediment, creating places for potential contaminants to be filtered out. We've got a lot of different activities on the landscape that contribute to extra sediment and extra soil that once they get into the water can cause problems for fish, can cause problems for drinking water quality. But if we've got some ponds along the way that whether they're, a wetland, just a pothole wetland out by itself, or a beaver catchment pond, right along on a stream, there's opportunity for that sediment to settle out, get utilized and broken down, and basically come out cleaner on the other side. Some really interesting research, out there that suggests that, up to 382 tandem dump trucks of sediment can be stored in a beaver pond. So obviously depending on size and what's happening in the watershed, but, really great potential for using a natural feature to help, lower our water treatment costs, have higher quality water for livestock, create excellent fish habitat. So, downstream of the beaver dams, there's, just kind of less of everything, because it acts as a place for that material to get utilized. And if a dam and a pond are in place for a really long time, it can start to create, an equilibrium and a balance between what's coming in, what's coming out, and what the plants and the microbes in that pond can do. So it's also a little bit about, or it's also about, storing water, raising our water tables, having a groundwater supply that can help to release water slowly throughout the year, or even during, drought times like this past year was in a lot of places around. In some of the driest years that we've had sort of in Alberta in the last 20 or so, there's a lot of the only water that was available was in beaver ponds. When smaller creeks or smaller wetlands had dried up, there was still some open water for different uses behind the beaver ponds or behind the beaver dams. And as mentioned, those canals or beaver runs, if anybody's ever been out for a walk, around a beaver area, you got to be careful or you end up over your head. That is another way that those ponds and those beaver areas, bring more water out into the landscape and recharge that groundwater. And there's way more water, beneath the ground that we can't see than is actually, visible above stream. And that helps with feeding, our other downstream areas throughout the year, and keeping our perennial streams perennial, and our perennial, lakes or wetlands having water in them more of the time. So beaver ponds are really about retention, detention, storage, and slow release. And I don't think we recognize necessarily the value of them until we have a dry year like we did have, and then realize, oh, wish I had that beaver dam, because then I'd have water for my livestock, as an example. So also really some interesting, really interesting stuff coming out about beavers and fire, and the ability of a wetter landscape to be, have less intensive and less expansive fires, because wet doesn't burn as hot as dry can. So there's some really interesting research and work on, maybe that's another reason for trying to keep some more beaver ponds, on the landscape, is just to minimize those impacts of wildfire or fire in general that is still part of our natural system. So sort of how does that work? Well, how does that water get stored? Well, part of it is because of the dam and the pond, right? They act as steps through the valley and through the landscape that slows the water down, allows the water to spread out over a larger area, so there's less energy, so it doesn't carve and move as much soil, not as much erosion. And that can basically slow water down, which dampens the flood peak That's not going to stop flooding, but they could just sort of slow that peak and have a higher base flow afterwards. And as we see, different variability in the climate and in the what we're seeing, in terms of more water, less water, more often, less often. It's kind of hard to tell, but those concepts of having beavers on the landscape can help again to just sort of mitigate some of those and help us adapt to those changing variables. So we've talked about wildlife. Beaver are a keystone species, so they have the ability to create habitat for a lot of other animals. So everything from plants to insects to larger mammals. They rely on beaver ponds and riparian areas in general for a lot or all of their life cycle. So having that diversity of trees and shrubs and plants and water depths and good water quality and good water temperatures, abundant water is beneficial for just that biodiversity that we need on our landscape, not only for just ecosystem function, but just to enjoy, as humans getting out in nature. And the connection and connectivity that beaver complexes create is also valuable for wildlife. It helps different amphibian species get from, one pond to another or across an area that spans out the genetic diversity, and just helps that population thrive and be healthy. So I guess, in a nutshell, beavers do a lot for the landscape. Everything from, changing the way that channels are developed and how they function, to the way that sediment and materials are transported throughout a watershed. They build and maintain wetlands. They help with water quality downstream, modify habitat in general. So not bad for, a 20-kilogram rodent. So I'm going to take a break right there and just see if there's any questions. That's kind of the warm and fuzzy part of this presentation.
Hey, Carrie, are you able to see the questions in the chat?
I can, but it would be better because you guys have been sort of tracking them as they've come in. So
yeah, I think there's just this one at the bottom here.
Okay.
Oh, and then there's one a little higher up. I'll just send it direct to you.
Okay, so one question, what are the beaver's main predators and what is the lifespan? Great question. So the main natural predators of a beaver would be bear, cougar, wolf, coyote the odd time, and of course humans. And I think on average their lifespan is about 10 years, but they can live up to 16 or so in the wild. But of course, predation, disease, the odd falling tree maybe can be reasons that they might not live that long. And particularly when the young ones disperse in the spring, they're at a higher risk as well. Can beavers survive in a man-made pond? A wooded area, do they need nearby? Lots of questions in there. Beavers can survive in a man-made pond. I've seen them, they sometimes come into dugouts. but could a farmer dig a pond and bring, so I'm going to get to this in a little bit, but just the concept of, you know, digging ponds and bringing beavers in. Beavers actually can't be relocated in Alberta without special permit. So they need to have a food, you know, that's just not allowed. So in order for them to survive, obviously they would need an adequate water depth. They would need a good wooded area nearby. I think the research suggests that, you know, they'll take like an acre of aspen a day for a colony. If I've got that stat right.
Acre of aspen a year, Carrie.
Oh, acre of aspen a year. Thanks, Kirby. As I say, a day, that's a lot of wood. And yeah, so that's a bit of a tricky one, but definitely the relocation, you know, bringing beaver in, part of that kind of changes the situation there. In the corner of a bay on a lake. Yeah, they live in wetlands. They live on lakes. They can live in both. So it's very possible that they would be taking trees next to a lake. Great question about how many beaver families would be maintaining the largest beaver dam in the world. I would think it's probably generations of beaver families. I wouldn't know the number though. What types of disease place beavers at risk? Excellent question. A couple that I've heard of are tularemia is one, and you may have heard of like Giardia, beaver fever. That's not necessarily a parasite that affects the beaver themselves, but all wild animals can carry that. So, but that disease affects you know, different animals instead. There's one other disease. I'm just, again, and maybe Kirby, you know off the top of your head, there's one other disease that affects them, but I can't remember what it is at the moment. Can private landowners apply to introduce beavers to a wetland on their property? Sometimes, as a special permit. The Fish and Wildlife in Alberta are not super supportive of reintroducing beaver based on, you know, the fact that being able to ensure that they have adequate food supply, adequate habitat, you know, not introducing them into an area where there already are other beaver and just, you know, basically sending them to an impending death. So not as a general rule, but through special permit, you might be able to, particularly related to research or something like that. Do beaver move on when they've cut down all the trees? Yeah, if they've eaten themselves out of house and home, they will move on and basically allow that area to grow back up. But they may very well come back in the future. Could be the same beaver, maybe different ones. Somebody said, yeah, okay, yeah, 10 years about, but can live up to about 16. How many beaver fit, how do beaver fit into an urban environment? Good question. We'll have to put you in touch with Kirby on that.
Yeah, thanks, Sherry. I actually had already shared an article related to something you talked about that Dr. Sherry Westbrook and I had published related to beavers in an urban environment. So it's at 729 in the chat. I can post it again here. So that was beavers in Saskatoon, but certainly applicable to many other cities along prairie streams, prairie rivers. And then we've done, of course, some work with the Friends of Fish Creek Provincial Park in Calgary, and can have Katie and others in this presentation talk more about their urban beavers and their urban beaver experiences if people are interested. Yeah, so I mean, I think the way they fit is they create habitat, they create areas for green space to have some nature within the city.
There's definitely some different management techniques that you need to think about in terms of, you know, trees and that sort of thing. And there are some places where they may not be suitable. But definitely from that, you know, helping with water treatment downstream is another sort of bigger picture role that beaver can play in an urban environment. So, so they do fit, but definitely the potential for conflict is higher because, you know, just of the sheer more number of people in those areas.
Yeah, and I could say too, a really important point to remember in urban areas is natural systems aren't static, nor are they meant to be. So you need that dynamic change, that cycle of renewal, and beavers serving as a disturbance agent are a way of initiating that disturbance, that renewal cycle within our urban areas.
Thanks, Kirby. The question to Fish Creek Park, I think I will leave that one. And if we have time at the end, perhaps if there's anybody from Fish Creek that wants to address that, we can do that. What happens after beaver has harvested all the trees around the pond? Okay, that one was asked already. Beavers in the Pine Barrens have been blamed for drowning Atlantic white cedar swamps. Yeah, I think that question from the States is kind of reflective of sort of what Kirby alluded to. You know, systems are dynamic and change. And again, you know, beaver have been on this landscape for a really, really long time. So there very well may have been times in the past when that area was flooded already and then dried out through that cycle. And then, you know, perhaps the person that planted the orchard there came in a dry time and then didn't necessarily, you know, think about that the water would ever come back up. I think that's a common thing that happens just in the way that humans act on the landscape. We got pretty short memories. If one of two parents in a family are culled, are the young likely to die as a result? That's a good, yeah, great question. I think it sort of depends on the stage and where that young are in their development. You know, if they haven't figured out how to build their dams and fend for themselves, then yeah, they likely won't make it. Others will, you know, if they've got a little bit of experience, they might be able to fend for themselves. And often I've learned recently, you know, that there's sometimes, you know, like aunts and uncles around that might be able to help out and take that beaver in. As long as they're sort of within the same family, they tend to, you know, not chase their own family members out. Oh, these are great questions. How do managers pick which and how many trees will be metal mesh protected? I would have to talk to a manager. I don't know what the particular you know, idea would be. Probably comes down to budget and time partially, as well as you know, where the most desired trees are, I would think would be some of the things that they would consider. I am aware that there is definitely beaver activity within Fish Creek Park. Catherine Hall, are you on? Or Amy McLeod?
Kate, it's Katie back in here from the Friends of Fish Creek. I'm happy to answer the questions about Fish Creek.
Okay,
can you hear me okay?
Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So I see two so far. One's from Gabrielle that says, how does Fish Creek Park manage their population? Do they move them or cull them? So currently, Alberta Parks is not doing any moving or culling of beavers in the park. The Friends of Fish Creek in 2020 initiated a Fish Creek Beaver Coexistence project to be able to balance the needs of humans and beavers on the landscape just in one specific part of the park. Anyone that's been here knows that this is a huge park. It's about 3,300 acres or 1,300 hectares. So neither Alberta Parks nor the Friends of Fish Creek have the resources to initiate beaver coexistence projects across the entire land base. So typically where beavers are active in Fish Creek, if their activities are not hindering any human infrastructure like pathways, bridges, benches and things like that. We just let them do their thing, and we, we'll take all the environmental benefits that come along with them being active on the landscape. Where their activities do hinder, specifically pathways is typically the biggest problem. Then we would like to explore doing more Fish Creek beaver coexistence work, but it takes a lot of resources to do that. And so we don't have the resources right now to just keep expanding and keep building more and more and more coexistence devices. So currently in the site down in the West End, we have 5 beaver coexistence devices, and Kirby England that has spoke earlier, he was heavily involved in that project and it's going really well. The next question was from, where was it? Here it is. A question from Greg. Are you aware of the beaver proliferation in Fish Creek Provincial Park and wondering how the monitoring is going? He says, it is astounding how they've changed the landscape over the years, and it is a marvel to watch. So we have trained and equipped a team of about a dozen beaver coexistence monitoring volunteers, and they regularly check out the coexistence devices, and they enter their observations into a digital app that's map enabled. And then when maintenance is required, we round up the troops and get out there with potato rakes and Pulaskis and waders and things. But we've only had to do 2 maintenance outings since the devices were installed, and 4 of the 5 were installed 14 months ago. So in more than a year, only 2 outings. And then the 5th one was just installed in June, and we've had no issues with it since. So it's been going really, really well. I highly recommend Kirby England and Ubetula Environmental. He was really, really great for that project. So if that answers all the questions, that's great. If there's any more, I'm happy to answer more.
Thanks, Katie. If any more comes in, we'll address them at the end.
Okay, thank you.
Awesome. And then there's just one last question that we'll address right now is, do beaver dams prevent fish from spawning and have a detrimental effect on fish, or perhaps a positive effect on fish populations? I think the thing to remember with beaver dams and fish is that, at least with our native species, they've evolved with beaver and beaver dams on the landscape. So they generally can work their way up over and through a beaver dam. Obviously, during low flow periods, some fish may end up, hanging out in the behind the pond instead, and waiting for springtime to move around. There's some, the research is still a little bit. I'm seeing it both ways with some of our non-native species, where they might not be able to navigate some of those beaver dams, but as a general rule, fish and beaver have gotten along for a lot of years, and there's definitely benefits to cooling water temperatures, and just creating that deeper water habitat. All right, great questions. Thank you so very much. I'm learning a lot just from your questions. Okay, so let's talk about conflicts. They've already come up a little bit. With this poll, I'd like to know sort of what are some of the things that you guys are dealing with, sort of your main issue or challenge around beaver. Or just, if you don't have any, that's an option too. So what's the biggest issue or challenge with beavers on our landscape, in your opinion? All right, so a range from nothing, cutting down trees, block culverts, flooded roads, flooded trails, pasture fields, and something else. Okay, perfect. This next section is going to touch on, acknowledging some of the challenges that beavers face or beavers pose when they are interacting in landscapes where humans are also very active. Because we know there's a lot of benefits and we can see value in having beavers on the landscape, but we also then need to think, okay, what kinds of situations can we sort of make that work? So the issues can be many. As you saw that list there, there's everything from flooded roads, flooded pastures, flooded trails, fence lines that end up underwater sometimes, downed trees in a variety of places, undermined trails and roads as beavers sort of build their canals and expand their habitat. Potential damages to infrastructure, whether it be roadways or the accidental machinery in a wet spot. This is a grand dam that's that within is a culvert. So blocked culverts often, right from top to bottom is an issue, which then results in road flooding. And a lot of the municipalities need to, are dealing with this sort of thing on a constant basis. Tunnels and underground, holes and things create potential tripping hazards for livestock and people. They like to chew things, not only wood, but things like telephone cables. And you may have heard they took out the entire internet of entire BC town not too long ago. So they'll go after certain things, even PVC pipe, like on livestock watering systems. And being aware of those prized trees that might be around a park or a yard or areas that that people are wanting to keep larger trees, taking down trees, because when they chew a lot. And we've talked about, we know now a little bit, or hopefully you have a better understanding of why they're doing that, right? It's about survival. It's about creating food and shelter, and basically a good habitat so that they can survive and have young and live, long, healthy lives. And they're quite busy, obviously, and this says no, he's not busy. In fact, that whole thing is just a myth. So there's lots of activity on the landscape, and then when that coincides with all the human activity, that's when we can run into some of these challenges. Because if these things were happening, out in the back 40, maybe not a big issue. So what are the beaver management options? What can individuals, what can municipalities, whether they're urban or rural, what can people do with these beavers? Well, one option is leave them be, let them do their thing. But there's also some actual actions that people can take, and I'll just run through some of these to give you a bit of a taste. So this is where we're thinking about, what are different ways than just blowing up the dam, or removing that dam constantly, or just taking out the beavers, whether it's through lethal means or live trapping. So these deterrents are literally the big bangs, and are two of the most commonly utilized tools for, I'll say, dealing with beavers where people don't want them. Now, the thing about live trapping is, as I mentioned, relocation of beaver in Alberta is not, just allowed as a general rule. So that live trapping also generally leads to a lethal solution. And because beaver habitat, particularly where it's good, you're kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't, because if you remove those beavers, it opens up a vacuum and something else is going to fill it, generally another beaver. So it's just it's an ongoing battle, if you will, when we're only utilizing these two techniques. And they've been used for a lot of years, and there definitely still is a role for those techniques to play. But the idea with beaver coexistence tools is that there's strategies designed to help deal with the problem, but also prevent an alternative to those other two options. Because sometimes, you know, if you're at a park, for example, you might not be able to do some of those things. There's also some efficiencies and cost effectiveness that, you know, using these tools can actually help, you know, with cost savings in the long time, over the long term, in terms of repeated road maintenance and repairs, the infrastructure damage, trees being lost and then having to be replaced. The idea of coexistence also allows the beaver to maintain their dam, maintain their pond, maintain their lodge on the landscape for all of those other values that we've talked about. So it's sort of finding that win for the beaver and win for sort of the human environment as well. And some examples that we'll touch on are pond levelers, culvert protectors, tree wrapping, and we'll touch a little bit on some bigger picture things as well, like planning and thinking about, you know, beaver and what they do and how we could just avoid putting ourselves in a situation that could result in a beaver problem down the road. So beaver coexistence tools, you know, have sort of been growing throughout Alberta in the last little while. This is just a bit of a schematic that shows just the projects that I know about, where, you know, there was very few of them that were well known sort of before 2016, and then once we started looking and finding demonstration sites and trying to pilot these things, they've been growing exponentially ever since. There's other jurisdictions in the States, for example, that have been doing this for a lot of years and have lots of good experience to share as well. So if you want to check out some of the projects, the map of beaver tools, which is on the rockies.ca website, that's the maintained by the Mastaki Institute as part of the Beaver Collaborative. You can click on zoom in on a spot and find out a little bit about, you know, what's going on there. And if you have a project that you've been working on and you want to put it on the map, you can get in touch with me and I can help you get it up there. So this next question, have you tried any ways to coexist with beavers? I'm interested to know. I'll give you some sort of just sort of yes, no, just want to know where you're at with that and whether they worked or not. Okay, good. So some people have tried, some people had tried, but it didn't really work, and others just don't know what to do. Okay, great. Well, hopefully this part of the presentation will get you thinking about some things that you can do, or maybe some tweaks you could make for something that you tried before. So big picture, you know, how do we sort of deal with some of these beaver things? One of it is basically understanding, you know, why do beavers do what they do, just like we're doing tonight, getting a sense of, you know, maybe building a higher tolerance for where they can do their activities and where maybe we could change our activities, and just becoming more aware of what some of the options are. Thinking about, you know, watershed management and planning. If you've ever thought about a road berm with a culvert in it, you know, what does that look like? Well, that's a big old dam with a hole in it that a beaver is going to be really attracted to trying to plug. So, you know, are there opportunities where we can put in bridges instead of culverts? Because at least with the bridge, there's a bit of a larger area that they would have to try and dam up. I've seen it done, particularly on trails, but you know, in theory, that larger area, you know, where can we put our influence to make different decisions potentially? Thinking about, you know, where is suitable habitat for beaver? You know, and if it's a very limited supply in a particular area, you know, maybe we shift the way we think about developing in that region. You know, just things like that, sort of big picture questions that are a challenge to think about, particularly on a watershed scale, but you know, might be able to help address different levels of the beaver human conflict. Thinking about policy development, you know, we get lots of questions. You know, people are saying, I really don't want the beaver on my landscape. I would like to move them somewhere else. And then we've got another list of people that say, I would like to have beaver on my landscape. How do I get one? Right now, you know, some of the policy out there doesn't allow that to happen easily. So some of this, implementing some of these tools or helping utilizing beaver the way we want to are limited right now just because of policy. Also, some of the, you know, rules and regulations around, you know, removing beaver dams and removing beaver, those are sort of well ingrained in the policy that, you know, they don't have many restrictions around them. Whereas if you want to do some of this coexistence, there may be more sort of hoops that you have to jump through. And so part of the Beaver Collaborative is you know, working through some of the different regulations and figuring out, you know, are there ways that we can streamline some of these processes. At the actual sort of land, you know, base level, there's things like habitat management. So the idea of, you know, if you're taking down trees or you've got a good aspen stand and you want beavers to be building in a particular location, is literally feeding them, you know, bringing them a buffet of aspen to get them started, and you know, to give them a sense of, I would rather you work here than over there. Same idea with audio cues. This is definitely happened out in Eastern Canada. You know, the sound of running water, right, is what triggers them to build. So put a ghetto blaster out there, sound of running water, and the experience that I heard is literally overnight. That ghetto blaster was covered in mud and sticks and dammed up. And so it moved away from, I think it was a problem culvert or something like that, basically drew their activity elsewhere. Thinking about, you know, are there places we can just let them have the creek, you know, from a grazing perspective or from a, you know, development perspective, giving them space and an area where they can fell trees and they can build, you know, they can build dams and create water. In a grazing situation, things like a riparian pasture, you know, moving your fences back a little bit, you know, about wider so that they've got the floodplain to flood and trees and habitat to work through, and then potentially move on. So utilizing these riparian areas as, you know, outlets, which is one of the functions that they perform, and not restricting them or thinking, you know, that we need to use them all the time for our purpose. So these ideas are kind of like, you know, bribe Robin Hood, figuring out a way to bribe those beavers, move that beaver activity to somewhere that would be more desirable. Lots of questions around trees. So barriers is another technique. So this is things like wire wrapping. There's just, you know, a few guidelines. You want to make sure you wire wide around the tree, use a relatively stiff gauge of wire, and go at least a meter high. And this is, you know, in a country that gets snow, you know, you want to make sure that wire is high enough that they don't just climb up, and if they're out there, they might be chewing on that tree, or it's high enough that they can not get at it. And if it's too tight, it can girdle the tree and end up killing the tree. And if we use too soft a wire, they can often just pull it down. And you can also, you know, there's the individual tree wrapping idea. You can also fence larger areas potentially with some of these different fencing techniques. Other barriers are thinking about culverts. So this would be things like these T culverts that were put in Foothills County. The road was redone a few years back, and so they put an extension on the culvert with a vertical T that the beaver can't get into, and that keeps water flowing, particularly in the high flows. And as far as I know, they haven't had much trouble with them since then. And they've also saved $5,000 to $10,000 annually with that technique. So they invested in them up front, but then they had less maintenance costs, less repair costs over the years. And so it actually reduced, there was cost savings in the end. So fencing out of culverts is another technique that can be used. It's another sort of a barrier. It's an example in Lac St. Anne County where beavers were plugging up this culvert. County was there all the time trying to clear it out because there was an acreage development community upstream of here. And so an exclusion fence was put in, but you can see it's rather square and not a lot of area on either side. And so the beavers eventually did figure this out and started to dam up on it. So that particular structure didn't necessarily resolve the issue that they wanted, but adding this pipe to the fence, which is basically a combination of an exclusion and a pond leveler, has helped mitigate that issue, and they haven't had to come back. And part of the reason that we think that exclusion didn't work quite on its own is because it didn't have the sort of ideal trapezoidal shape. So having a fairly long distance that and on an angle that beavers have to work a lot harder to try and dam that up. And so keep thinking about if you're going to do an exclusion fence, you need quite a bit of room where you could actually, create this large structure that would generally stop the beaver from damming up along it. So I'm going to skip this poll actually, Kyle. So I'm going to skip this one and just tell you that there are regulatory considerations when thinking about managing the water with beaver. There's considerations for Water Act. There's considerations for Public Lands Act, which could be a temporary field authorization or Department License of Occupation, as well as Federal Fisheries Act, particularly in fish-bearing streams. So a lot of our streams and rivers are, Crown-owned, bed and shore. So there is still some inconsistencies throughout the province. So anybody who's interested in doing any of these, culvert protections or pond levelers in a freestanding dam that I'm going to touch on now, we definitely encourage you to talk to your local authorities and find a contact within the government departments to determine if you do need approval, and then give yourself enough time to apply before you start. So what is this thing called pond leveler? So it's kind of come up a couple of times. So basically it's a way to maintain a pond at a cooperative level. So it's a flexible pipe that has an intake cage on the end that protects the water coming in. And then the height that the outlet end of the pipe is set is essentially how long or how high the water will flow until it reaches that desired level. So it's a way to maintain a beaver pond, maintain a beaver dam, but set the pond height at a level that might reduce flooding throughout the season, as well as to sort of mitigate that flooding issue. You also need at least 3 waters depth, or 3 feet of water depth, because that helps with the beaver habitat, right? We talked earlier that they need that, at least that amount in order to overwinter. So ideally the pond leveler is designed and set at a height that meets that goal, as well as the flooding issue. So the idea is that the pipe isn't, large enough to take all the water that's ever going to flow through that water body. It's designed to overflow in the spring and during high rains, and then continue to flow until it reaches the height that outlet is set at. So these techniques, like a lot of things, are not completely maintenance free. This is an example where, this was in a beaver complex, and about a week after the install, the beaver were coming up from the bottom, which they typically don't, but we're plugging up the outlet. So adding just a piece of mesh on the outlet end and covering it up with sticks can help to mitigate sort of that issue, particularly in a complex where there's, pond after pond after pond, and beavers are swimming freely and can get at that outlet pipe. Doesn't happen all the time, but definitely something to be aware of and maybe just address right at the beginning. Using double wall pipe versus single walled pipe, both can be used in a pond leveler tool, particularly this flexible design that we've been learning about over the last few years. On the double wall, there's some pros to it. It's thicker, it's got 2 layers, it's quieter. Beavers react again to that sound of running water. So if water's moving through that pipe, they're less likely to chew through it. Whereas the single wall pipe definitely is more flexible. So if you've got tight quarters, or need to bend around a corner or something, can be valuable that way, but it's only single layer, so it can be chewed through a lot louder if not submerged. And those are just some of the differences between the two. There's cons as well. The double wall is sometimes more expensive. It's a little harder to move the bigger that you get. But it generally withstands our freeze thaw cycles a little bit better too than some of these single walled ones. There's other designs as well, like the Smoky Lake County. When we started doing this work, we learned that they'd been doing this stuff since 2005 using what they call a gizmo. Theirs is PVC pipe with an elbow on the end, and they've sort of worked these things into their beaver management program over the last 15 years. And they've got, over 40 locations in the county that they're using these things. So just an example from Massachusetts that just shows, effectiveness at resolving a beaver issue using trapping versus a flow device that is installed properly. And I think it makes sense, intuitively you'd think, okay, well, that trapping, is really effective, right off the hop. But then as time goes on, the habitat, is still there. New beavers move in, and potentially, you're basically coming right back to that same issue after, whatever the length of time is. But that flow device will tend to, continue to keep that site issue free for a longer period of time. The lifespan, they're not meant to, last forever, but maybe, good 10 years or so, and then you can reevaluate and see if you want to reinstall. And there's good, there's cost saving data there as well. There's a long standing history of using these devices in Massachusetts and showing, 44% savings annually over that time period. And again, there's investment up front for sure, but comparing it to the cost of equipment, cost of repeated manpower, going back to a site over and over and over again, that's where those savings come in. So we've got some examples of this close to home as well. So Beaver County is just east of Edmonton. And in 2014, They undertook sort of a beaver coexistence project in conjunction with Dr. Glennis Hood at the University of Alberta, and put in a number of pond levelers around the county. And then also they did a sort of a human perception survey, as well as a cost benefit analysis as well. And they, over 3 years, calculated a net benefit of, on those locations, of about $65,000. And then when you take into account, you know, all that wetland value, you know, that number goes up into the 300,000s. They did have a variety of costs. This was a few years ago, so costs definitely have gone up since then. But the average cost was about $1,000 at that time, and the maintenance and monitoring they found was quite low after we're installed. Nearby in the Cooking Lake Blackfoot Provincial Recreation Area, again, just an example of, you know, the animal before the monitoring costs for pond levelers that were put in for 12 devices there was about $16,000, compared to prior to that, you know, over $100,000 for maintenance, maintenance that way. So again, as time goes on, you know, does that number start to shift? It likely definitely does as things change, but definitely within these first, you know, 3 to 10 years, there's definitely seeing a positive result. And yeah, again, traditional management, they also were spending prior to the coexistence tools about $20,000 on the traditional removal, dam removal with equipment, as well as taking beavers out. And the total cost per site, you know, well down from that. And Elk Island Park, similar situation. So there's definitely, you know, a positive cost benefit opportunity with some of these tools. So throughout Alberta, you know, still from this survey that was done in 2018, you know, trapping and shooting are still the most common ways of working, dealing with beaver, and flow devices about, you know, 5%. But I think that's starting to grow. Be interesting to do this survey again in another 5-10 years and see where we're at. So thanks to Dr. Hood for doing that work. You know, spending $3 million on, you know, beaver dam removal and repairs and maintenance to infrastructure. Definitely, there's some opportunities to reduce some of those costs in some places. So I mean, I think that the take-home message that I want people to know about is that these opportunities are out there, and they're not going to work in every situation. There's going to be some places, you know, some instances where the traditional methods are still the best option, but we're definitely finding that there are places where doing something different can be a great help, not only for, say, the municipality, but also for the beaver population, habitat, ecosystem services, all those things that we've talked about. So we have the opportunity to hear from 3 municipalities that work in the area of that Highway 2 conservation is a part of. So I'm going to turn it over first to Ryan, who's going to talk about some examples in Athabasca County.
You bet. Thanks, Carrie.
Do you want to introduce yourself, Ryan, too, just who you are, what you do?
Yeah, so I'm Ryan Hercue. I'm the Assistant Ag Fieldman with Athabasca County. I just started here recently. I wasn't present for this specific install, but we've installed one since, and it seems to be, well, if we get some rain, it'll be performing well. But this area specifically where this one was installed in 2020. It was a chronic new problem area for us, lots of trapping. High water, kind of close to infrastructure, so it wasn't very good for blasting. So this was one of those areas that was flooding out the neighboring, I believe it was a tree farm, and just kind of needed to come up with a solution. So for this area, we installed the pond leveler, and I guess if we can go for the next pictures here. So 2019, 2020 were very wet years in Athabasca County and around the area. So we needed a solution. So H2C came with the pond levelers. So we built the cages on site, secured it. It was pretty decent area for site prep for this one. We can go next slide. And yeah, so the dam was slotted the day before. A little bit of water was released to kind of get it to the height we deemed acceptable for the outflow. I think we did it in October, so a little bit late in the season, but it was a little chilly for the people, but it all went in pretty good. Pipe was secured in, the beavers mudded it right in, which was a great goal to see. We can go next slide. Maybe. And yeah, so it was kind of a poor year to be, I guess, judge the success of this one, since 2021 here was very dry. And the water level in this specific pond went down about 5.5 feet. So efficacy of the pond leveler in the spring when we were checking it, water levels were great. The pond leveler was flowing. There wasn't flooding on the upstream side of the dam, which was good. But in the fall here, when we went to check it again, there was, we had a pretty good little drought in the last few months of the season there. So the water was way down, but from what we could tell from all the pipe and everything, it's all sealed in really good. The beaver aren't plugging the pipe off, so I'm fairly confident if water levels return to what they should be, the pond leveler will keep functioning just fine. So.
Thanks, Ryan.
Yeah.
Lisa.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about the first pond leveler that H2C ever put in. We put it in October of 2018. So at this site, it's an outlet coming off Lake Wakameo. So there's tons of water that moved through this little outlet. And as Ryan said, 2019, 2020 were extremely wet years. There was a lot of flooding. But this pond leveler has kind of been our proof of concept, if you will. So it's in place. It's mudded in very well by the beaver. The trapper hasn't been out there since, so it's worked fairly well. We did this as a bit of a training session. We had all my H2C counties there. We had Cows and Fish teaching us how to do it, and we also had Ducks Unlimited and Adrian from the Fish Bearers Association. Now he's with Human Solutions in BC. So we use it as a training session to show our municipalities that, you know, these could work under the right circumstances. And it's been our pilot project, and yeah, it's worked fairly well since. So you can go to the next slide there. Yeah. So we dug the dam out by hand. Out of all the pond levelers we put in, I think this was the one that went the smoothest, actually. So it seems like anchoring on shore seems to be the most successful way of getting the leveler in position. So you do need to have, you know, a few people to do these sort of things. So we've been going with at least minimum of 5 people, the more the merrier kind of thing. Many hands light work, that sort of thing. But yeah, anchoring it, if you get the chance, as you can see, my one coworker there, anchoring it on the banks seems to be the easiest way to get them in place without people going for a swim or having it fall out too soon and not being in the right position. Yeah, so like I said, there's been no problems to date. The trapper hasn't been out to the site since the summer of 2018. And before that, he said he could basically live at that site. So again, like Carrie mentioned, the ideal place for these pond levelers are places where the beaver are always going to be there. It's coming off, this outlet comes off a lake. There's always going to be beaver at this site. So you can either keep doing the same thing and, you know, it's a huge time and resource sink, or we can try something else. And yeah, the results have been pretty positive on this one.
Thanks, Lisa. Barhead, Kyle.
Sure. So these pictures are showing some dryness. That is because, as we stated, this year was declared an agricultural disaster. due to drought. Normally the picture on the left there is no algae, no weeds showing on the sides. That is full of water. This was a site that we've been at many times. And we didn't really we started to thinking like, why do we keep coming back here? If we keep trying to control the beaver, they're just going to move. Right now, this spot here is very accessible to us. We can work with this. Actually, the landowner wants to keep the watershed, the wetland there. So we decided, okay, this is a good site. We're going to put a pond leveler in here and just see what happens. And that's what we did here this year. You can go to the next one there, Carrie. So this is the site. The water is down. So floating out was different. Yeah, it sounds easier on paper than what it is actually is to do in practice. You're supposed to put the cage on a float and then float out by boat, pull the float out, and it's supposed to sink in nicely until the tube doesn't want to stay underneath that cage, or if the pipe decides to twist, it'll go over, and then you're kind of rushing to get it in place before it disappears forever. And that tube did not make it home that day.
That was my tube, by the way.
Sorry, Lisa. So this is it finally in place there. Before it was sunk in. Once you put the cage in, it sinks down and takes a while. But you can see on the right picture how the pipe is sticking out of the dam a little ways. That's because that's how low the water was this year. We ran out of sites to put this in. Normally in a year, we'll have a trapper going out there. We'll spend about 30 grand on salaries and remove about 250 to 300 beaver in a year. Lethal trapping, we do not do live moves. So this year has been quite quiet on the trapping side of things because the water level being so low. They aren't causing any sort of issues. So next year it can run off. Well, with the amount of snow we got here today, we've got about a foot of snow here. Runoff in the spring looks pretty positive. So we could see this actually being effective. Right now it's kind of at a spot where we're not too sure what's going to be at the right level. So we're going to reassess in the spring when it's going, then dig it down if we have to. When you dig it down, that's good. You cannot dig it back up if you go down too deep. And so if you take the water down to a point where it's too low, the beaver will move, and then the pond leveler is useless. You can go to the next one there, Carrie. And that was the drone shot we took. So you can see how far it was in the dam. The dam is from, well, you can see from the tip of the pipe on the top there, about a good 15 feet. Like half the pipe is mostly exposed, right? That's how deep the water, how shallow the water is. In the cage now, it is submerged in that picture. It is exposed right now, just because since then the water has gone down even more. So we'll check it out in the spring. But we have high hopes. This is the same thing we put an exclusion fence on the inlet to this pond. So it's kind of the pilot project for the county. We're going to see how this works, and if it saves money in trapping fees over the next few years, I'm all for it.
Great. Yeah, thanks you guys. Yeah, in Alberta, for those aren't familiar, the municipalities and counties are sort of responsible for beaver management, and they everybody, all of them have a beaver management program, and lots like these three are starting to implement some of these different tools. And the three of them highlighted a few things that I want to just reiterate. This is 40 feet of pipe. And so that basically draws the intake and the feel or the suction and sound of water well away from the dam. So the beaver may continue to dam up along the dam and along the pipe nearby to the dam, but they typically won't get out this far. So that's why that the cage, as well as the position of and length of pipe, are two considerations to helping these be successful. So, are we going to just leave everything to beaver? I don't think so. There's always going to be an element where, the human decision needs to be part of it. And but I think hopefully we've given you guys some things to think about, that there may be other options out there. And there definitely is, there's that economic potential for cost savings that, even if, these three counties don't have to go back to those three sites, as often, that reduces the amount of cost that they spend on those and gives them opportunity to do a work, on something different somewhere else. So there's a number of awareness materials that are available to you guys, particularly on the Cows and Fish website, as well as at rockies.ca. So there's fact sheets, as well as some videos on installing both a pond leveler as well as a culvert exclusion. This awareness, there's booklets and fact sheets just on, beaver ecology, history, management, as well as, some summaries of the cost benefit analysis that we shared with you tonight. We are, through the Cows and Fish and the collaborative with Mastaki, we are trying to build, a community of practice. So a group of folks that are trying these things out, are willing to share their experiences and the lessons that they're learning with others, and also to draw upon expertise, and experience. So, so that there's a greater amount of brain power and manpower that can help with some of these things. So if you're interested in getting on the mailing list, you can contact Holly also through the website and check out that map of tools. So thinking about the riparian landscape as the unique part of the watershed that it is, and thinking about all the different values and functions and the importance of these relatively small areas to so many other things that are happening on the watershed, from environmental, social, economic aspects, and thinking about not only just grazing management or urban development or recreation or crop, cropping activities, but where can the beaver fit into how we want our watersheds to look and how we want our landscapes to function. We have to remember, that things are dynamic. As Kirby mentioned, these riparian systems are dynamic. There's high water, low water, different things happening. And what really they need is time and space in order to do what they do. So being able to recover naturally, being able to grow all those native plants that provide such good filtering, such good buffering capacity, deep binding roots. And when we think about these landscapes and these valleys, giving them the time and the space to do and perform those ecological functions and fitting the beaver into that system is ultimately going to be the way that we're able to be successful. So with that, we've got time for questions, and I'd love it if people could hang on through the question period, as we do have a post survey, or maybe we'll do the post survey now. And then, no, let's not. Let's do the questions first. So let me see. Lisa or Kyle, did you have any ones that popped out to you?
Just taking a look, see here, Gary.
Let's see.
Okay, from Greg, he asked, what has been your experience with the conflict between beavers and property owners / farmers, etc., in terms of appreciation of the importance of beavers and willingness to use cooperative efforts? Do you encounter cases involving lethal efforts?
So yeah, so lots of conversations with farmers about beavers on their landscapes, whether they're plugging culverts or flooding fields, things like that. But like a lot of things, just knowing that there's different options out there often changes the way that they view that beaver. Is there still a lot of situations where removing the beaver, removing the dam is still happening? Absolutely. But there's I talk to a lot of people that that are quite open-minded about it, are sometimes willing to try new things and set themselves up to be a pilot or a demonstration site for learning these areas.
Next one here will be from Jerry. Leaving it to beavers, with that scenario, just giving them the area. What happens when they use up all the existing trees? Do they leave some trees there or move on to the next patch?
They'll typically move on. Yeah, because they don't have that food source anymore. They may travel farther and then return back to that same pond or that same dam for a while. But in the end, yeah, they may end up having to move on just because they don't have that food source.
Sure. Okay, next one from Joanne. What is the beaver's protection status, or is there none?
There is none.
There is none.
No.
That's
yeah,
why
no.
each municipality has their trapping program. So.
Yeah, exactly.
Beavers are still fur bearers.
Pardon me?
Sorry? Beavers are still fur bearers. So they're fur-bearing mammals, which means they're protected under the Wildlife Act, but they are also able to be shot on private land with permission of the landowner.
Right. So yeah. So I guess what I was thinking was that, as far as having population status and things like that, like we don't necessarily have any good numbers like that because they're the departments that look after that figured that they're not in any risk of being extirpated again right now. So
so next one is from Angie. So thinking about beaver impacts to urban park trees in a large river watershed, what coexistence tools would be recommended in addition to wiring or fencing individual or groups of trees?
So I think the wiring and fencing, I think is good. The potential for maybe drawing the animals away from a particular spot. So I don't know if they have a lodge there or they have a dam, right there. Maybe there's a different spot that they could be damming instead. Those are two that come to mind right away. But if they're taking down the trees, then the wiring or fencing is probably going to be your best options.
Sure. And then from Lewis, what is the microbiome of beavers comprised of that allows them to digest trees?
Great question. I don't know the names of what they've got in there, but they've got a number of different bacteria in their gut that allow them
back from Google soon. Yeah.
yeah. I don't know exactly what they've got in there, but yeah, definitely something different than we have.
Seems to be all we got here, Carrie, for now.
Okay, great. Yeah, there was some mention of just about, Adrian Nelson. There was actually a spelling mistake in the company that he works for now, but it's Humane Solutions out of BC. And okay. yeah, Humane Solutions. And they're a problem wildlife, I guess, consultant dealing not only with beaver, but with other animals as well. And he's been a great source of information and leadership here in Alberta to helping us learn, some of these different techniques and how they can be done.
So I'm going to be sending out a bunch of resources that Carrie sent me to you guys' email probably in the next couple days here. So if there's any other questions that you might have that we might be able to help you out with, you can always just respond back to my email. Yeah, and unless there's any other questions.
I just found one that says lots of pictures are showing of landscapes are showing oxbows. Is this preferred type of rivers and streams that attract beaver? Not necessarily. I think the reason that we see these oxbows is because over time, our channels have basically cut down into the valley and have separated from their old flow path over time. So the part of that is because of the reduction in beaver over history. So yeah, I wouldn't say that it's necessarily preferred type, but it does provide water nearby where they could potentially set up a lodge or something like that. So I think it's just the nature of the landscape that all those pictures sometimes show those oxbows.
All right, so I think that's all for questions. So thanks for everyone for tuning in, and I hope you learned something. And if you have any questions, you can always contact me, and I'll try to get you in with the people you need to talk to. But I would just like to take a second to thank Carrie from Cows and Fish for putting on this awesome presentation for us. And yeah, it was
and we
great.
do have the final poll, so please don't go yet.
One more poll. Okay.
This is just sort of our post-survey bit. That just helps us evaluate the effectiveness of this webinar tonight. So it's in 2 parts. So basically the same question we asked at the beginning, but has anything shifted for you? I realize it's only 2 hours, so if it hasn't changed, that's okay. And then the last one there is just, was there something in particular or more than one thing that you think you'd like to share with other people now that you've heard about it? And then once that's finished, I'll pop up my contact info. And if anybody wants to follow up with me afterwards, they're more than welcome as well. Thanks to everybody who contributed their thoughts and ideas today. Awesome, good. So everybody's learned some more things and has lots that they want to share. All right. So that's me. That's our website. My counterpart, Tanya, she's in Edmonton as well. And we have other staff around the province that through our website, you can also find contact information for. So yeah, thank you very much. Hi to some of the people that I apparently I've met before in different parts of Western Canada. And thanks for tuning in, everybody from wherever you were at.
Thanks, Carrie.
See you, everyone. Take care. Okay.